The wind in Dry Hollow had a voice, and it spoke of nothing but endings. It was a low, mournful sound that scraped across the cracked earth, carrying dust that tasted of grit and time. It rattled the splintered, sun-bleached planks of the shack Clara called home, a structure that leaned like a drunkard against the unforgiving Texas sky. At 17, Clara knew the wind's language better than she knew the touch of a mother's hand. It was the soundtrack to her life, a constant reminder of the emptiness that stretched both inside her and out across the desolate plains. Her mother, a woman she remembered only in hazy, sun-drenched fragments of memory, had been taken by a fever a decade ago, leaving behind a scent of lavender in a wooden chest and a daughter to fend for herself against the slow decay of her father. Jebediah. He was a man hollowed out by cheap whiskey and regret, his promises as thin and brittle as the pages of the old family Bible he no longer opened. Clara's days were a repeating cycle of chores, each one a small battle against the encroaching filth and despair. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles were raw, mended Jebediah's torn shirts with thread that was almost too fine to see, and cooked meager meals of beans and cornbread over a fire that always seemed to smoke more than it burned. Her hands, chapped and calloused, were not the hands of a young woman. They were the hands of a survivor. In the quiet moments, when the wind died down and the only sound was the buzzing of flies, she would allow herself to dream. It was a simple, desperate dream: to leave Dry Hollow, to find a place where the earth was not always thirsty, and to meet a man whose eyes held kindness instead of the vacant, grasping look she saw in her father's, a man who would see asterisk her asterisk, not just a pair of hands to do his work. One sweltering afternoon, the mail rider, a wiry man whose face was a permanent squint against the sun, dropped off a single letter. It was an unusual event. Mail was for folks with connections to the world beyond the horizon, not for the likes of Jebediah. Clara watched as her father tore it open with a trembling, grimy thumb. His eyes, usually clouded with a drunken haze, sharpened with a greedy focus she hadn't seen in years. He had done it, weeks ago, in a fit of drunken ambition. He had answered an advertisement in a tattered newspaper from Fort Worth, a notice seeking sturdy, God-fearing women for matrimony in the farther territories. He had written a response in his clumsy, barely legible script, embellishing Clara's qualities as if she were a horse he was trying to sell at market. He hadn't told her. Of course, he hadn't needed to. She was his daughter. In his eyes, she was his property. "It's done," Jebediah rasped, his voice thick. He waved the brittle paper in the air. "A man named Silas Vaughn. Got a good spread up in the Panhandle. He's agreed." Clara's heart seized in her chest, a cold, hard knot of fear. "Agreed to what, Pa?" she whispered, though she already knew. He grinned, a grotesque sight that stretched his tobacco-stained lips over broken teeth. "To the arrangement, he's a widower, needs a wife, and we need what he's offering." He leaned forward, the foul stench of whiskey washing over her. "A fine bullock, Clara, a healthy one, and a year's supply of good chewing tobacco." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. A cow, a skinny, rangy longhorn, most likely, and tobacco. That was her worth, the dream of a kind man, of a gentle touch, dissolved into this sordid, brutal transaction. "No," she said, the word a fragile breath. "Pa, you can't." For a moment, her defiance flickered in the dim light of the shack. It was a spark he was quick to extinguish. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm in a grip of iron. "Can't," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "I am your father. I have raised you, fed you, kept a roof over your head. You will do as you are told. You will be his wife." Her protest died in her throat, strangled by a lifetime of submission. There was no one to appeal to, no law in Dry Hollow that would side with a girl against her own father. Women were commodities, bartered and traded for land, for livestock, for peace between feuding families. She was no different. The next morning, he pulled the wooden chest from under his cot. Inside, wrapped in yellowed muslin, was her mother's wedding dress. It was simple, made of pale cotton with delicate, hand-stitched lace at the collar and cuffs. It smelled of cedar and a deep, abiding sorrow. As Jebediah forced her into it, the fabric felt like a shroud. It was too loose in the shoulders, a ghostly reminder of the woman she barely knew. A woman who had married for what she thought was love, only to wither away in this same desolate landscape. A man with a rickety wagon had been paid to take her. He was a stranger with impassive eyes who wouldn't look at her directly. As she climbed aboard the hard wooden seat, she took one last look at the shack. Jebediah was already standing by the corral, admiring the scrawny, dull-eyed cow that had been delivered at dawn, her purchase price chewing cud in the dust. He didn't wave. He didn't even look up. The journey north was a descent into a deeper hell. The landscape grew even more barren, a relentless panorama of scorched earth and thorny scrub. The sun was a merciless hammer in a sky the color of bleached bone. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, her dress, her hair, the inside of her throat. It was a gritty, constant presence, a taste of the land that was swallowing her whole. Far in the distance, a kettle of vultures circled lazily on the thermal currents, their dark wings stark against the pale canvas of the sky. They were patient, waiting for something to die. Clara felt a kinship with whatever creature lay below them. She, too, was being led to a slaughter of the soul. They traveled for 2 days, sleeping under the wagon at night, the cold of the desert floor seeping into her bones. The driver offered her hardtack and jerky, which she could barely swallow past the lump of terror in her throat. He spoke only to give directions to his mules. She was cargo, nothing more. Late on the second day, he pointed toward a cluster of dilapidated structures shimmering in the heat haze. "That's the Vaughn place," he grunted, and that was all. As they drew closer, Clara's last, flickering ember of hope was extinguished. The advertisement had spoken of a prosperous homestead. This was a graveyard. The fences were broken, their posts leaning at drunken angles. Weeds and thistle choked what might have once been a garden. The main house was a grim, 2-story box with a sagging porch and windows like vacant eyes. A sense of profound neglect and isolation hung over the place like a fever. A man emerged from the shadows of the porch. He was not just older than the letters had implied. He seemed ancient, carved from the cruel, unforgiving land itself. He was tall and stooped, with a mane of greasy, iron-gray hair, and a beard stained yellow with tobacco juice. His eyes, set deep in a wrinkled, sun-ravaged face, were the color of slate, cold and devoid of any light. They raked over her, from the top of her dusty head to the hem of her mother's dress, with a clinical, possessive scrutiny. This was Silas Vaughn. "Get down!" he commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order. Clara moved stiffly, her limbs aching from the journey. The wagon driver untied her small bundle of belongings and tossed it into the dust without a word before climbing back onto his seat and urging his mules away. Eager to be gone, the sound of the creaking wagon faded, leaving Clara alone in a suffocating silence with this stranger. Silas stepped closer, the sour smell of unwashed wool and old age clinging to him. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he grabbed her chin with a hand as gnarled and rough as a tree root, forcing her mouth open to inspect her teeth as one would a horse. "She'll do," he grunted, more to himself than to her. "Scrawny, but she has her teeth. Get inside, girl." He turned and shuffled into the house, leaving her to follow. The interior was even more grim than the outside. It was dark and stifling, thick with the smell of stale cooking grease, dust, and loneliness. Every surface was covered in a layer of grime. A few pieces of heavy, dark furniture stood like monoliths in the gloom. It was a house without a woman's touch, a house without life. He showed her to a small, airless room upstairs. It contained a narrow cot with a thin, lumpy mattress and a washstand holding a chipped ceramic basin. "This is yours," he said. "The work starts at sunrise. You'll cook, clean, and mend, and you'll learn a wife's duties." His slate-gray eyes held a look that made her skin crawl. There was no mistaking his meaning. The day's horror was not yet over. The true nightmare was about to begin. That evening, he sat at the head of the rough-hewn table while she served him a stew she'd made from the meager contents of his larder. He ate noisily, slurping and chewing with his mouth open, never once speaking to her or thanking her. He watched her every move, his gaze a physical weight. When he was finished, he pushed his chair back and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "Time for bed," he announced, a leering smirk twisting his lips. "The marriage bed." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Clara's exhaustion. I'm tired from the journey," she stammered, backing away. "All new brides are shy," he rasped, rising to his feet and starting toward her. "You'll get used to it. A wife has a purpose. Come now." He was between her and the stairs. For a split second, she was frozen, a terrified animal caught in a trap. Then, instinct took over. She darted past him, her heart hammering against her ribs, and scrambled up the creaking stairs. She threw herself into her small room, slammed the flimsy wooden door shut, and fumbled with the iron bolt, sliding it into place just as his heavy footsteps reached the landing. The handle rattled violently. "Open this door, girl," he roared, his voice muffled but full of rage. He slammed his fist against the wood, making the whole frame shudder. "You are my wife. You will do as I say." Clara pressed herself into the far corner of the room, her hands over her mouth to stifle her sobs. She listened to him curse and bang on the door for what felt like an eternity. Then, silence. A heavy, menacing silence that was almost worse than the noise. She heard his footsteps retreat down the stairs, followed by the sound of a bottle clinking against a glass. She remained in the corner, trembling, for hours. The moon rose, casting a pale, sickly light through the grimy window pane. The wind began its mournful song again, whispering through the cracks in the walls. It sounded like it was crying with her. She cried for her mother. She cried for the foolish, hopeful girl she used to be. She cried for the cow that was worth more than her life. The dream of love and kindness was a cruel joke, a childish fantasy, here in this desolate house, bound to a cruel old man. Her hope didn't just fade, it was murdered. All that was left was a cold, hollow ache in the center of her chest, a certainty that her life, as she had known it, was over. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, and the night had only just begun. The days that followed bled into one another, each a perfect replica of the last, painted in the same monotonous shades of dust and despair. The bolted door became Clara's only shield, a flimsy piece of wood and iron that separated her from the man who owned her. She learned to live on the edge of her nerves, her ears perpetually strained for the sound of his heavy, shuffling footsteps on the stairs. He did not try to force his way into her room again, but his presence was a constant, suffocating pressure. He had time. He was a patient predator, content to let his prey exhaust herself in the confines of the cage he had built. Her first and only attempt at escape came during the first week. She awoke before dawn, driven by a desperate surge of adrenaline, while Silas snored in his room downstairs, his drunken snores rattling the very floorboards. She had crept out of the house. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and damp earth. Freedom was a tangible thing, a taste on the air. Just a few hundred yards away, the horse barn was her destination, her only hope. But when she reached it, her heart sank into the pit of her stomach. The heavy door was secured with a thick, new padlock, the metal gleaming coldly in the pre-dawn light. She heard a floorboard creak on the porch behind her. She whirled around, her breath catching in her throat. Silas stood there, wrapped in a dirty blanket. a long-barreled rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He wasn't angry. He was smiling. A chilling, triumphant expression. "Looking for something, girl?" he rasped. He held up a large iron key, dangling it from his finger. "This is for the barn. I have the only one." He patted the stock of the rifle. "This is for fillies that think they can run. A bullet moves a hell of a lot faster than a scrawny girl like you. The vultures would pick your bones clean before you made it 5 miles. Now get back inside and start breakfast. You've wasted enough of the morning." The threat was not idle. Clara could see the cold certainty in his eyes. He would do it. He would shoot her down in the dirt and feel nothing but the inconvenience of having to find a replacement. From that moment on, the sprawling, empty landscape that she had once dreamed of escaping asterisk to asterisk became an extension of her prison, its vastness serving only to emphasize how trapped she truly was. He forbade her from stepping off the porch, and she obeyed. The world shrank to the size of the house, the porch, and the dusty yard. Her life became a litany of thankless tasks. She scoured pots that seemed to have a permanent layer of burnt-on grease. She beat dust from rugs that were so threadbare they threatened to disintegrate. She battled mice and spiders for control of the larder. In the midst of this drudgery, the small cruelties were the worst. One afternoon, while wrestling a heavy cast-iron skillet filled with sizzling fat off the wood stove, her grip faltered. The pan tipped, and a splash of scalding grease landed on the back of her hand. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and dropped the skillet with a loud clang, instinctively plunging her hand into the bucket of wash water. Silas looked up from the table where he was oiling a piece of tack, his expression one of mild annoyance at the noise. He glanced at the angry red welt already rising on her skin. "Be more careful with my food," he said flatly. He saw her biting her lip to keep from crying. "It's just a small wound," he added, a dismissive wave of his hand. "A wife needs to learn to endure. Stop your caterwauling and finish supper." His words were colder than any winter wind. It wasn't just a lack of sympathy. It was a fundamental denial of her pain, of her very humanity. The burn seared her skin, but his indifference scorched her soul. She was not a person to him. She was a tool, an object, and a tool that feels pain is defective. She wrapped her hand in a clean rag, the throbbing a constant, fiery reminder of her status in this house. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The blistering heat of summer began to yield to the crisp edge of autumn. And then, one morning, Silas did something unexpected. "Get yourself cleaned up," he ordered. "We're going to town. I need supplies." The word sent a jolt of something through Clara, a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. It was a terrifying, exhilarating flicker of hope. To leave the farm, to see other people, to breathe air that wasn't saturated with the scent of Silas Vaughan's decay. It was like being offered a sip of water after an eternity in the desert. She washed her face, braided her hair carefully, and put on the less worn of her 2 simple dresses. The prospect of being seen by others made her acutely aware of her frayed cuffs and the worn thinness of the fabric. The town, a bustling collection of false-fronted buildings huddled along a wide, dusty main street, was an assault on her senses. The noise was overwhelming. The rumble of wagons, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the cacophony of voices shouting and laughing. The smells were a rich tapestry of horse manure, fresh baked bread from the hotel, sawdust from the lumber mill, and the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder that seemed to hang permanently in the air. For the first time in months, Clara saw women in colorful dresses, their faces bright with purpose. She saw children chasing a stray dog, their laughter like music. It was a world that was alive, and the sight of it made her own lifeless existence feel all the more stark. Silas kept a bruising grip on her upper arm, steering her through the crowd like she was a wayward calf. His ownership was a visible brand. People nodded at him, their greetings a mixture of respect and fear. Silas Vaughan owned one of the largest spreads in the county, and he had a reputation for a quick temper and a long memory. Clara desperately scanned the faces of the people they passed, her eyes sending a silent, frantic plea for help, for recognition. But no one met her gaze for more than a fleeting second. They saw her, saw the hand on her arm, saw the bleakness in her eyes, and they looked away. They had their own lives to live, their own troubles to bear. Getting involved with Silas Vaughn was a trouble no one wanted. He dragged her into the general store, a cavernous room filled with barrels of flour, bolts of cloth, and shelves stacked high with canned goods and tools. While he haggled with the storekeeper over the price of coffee and ammunition, Clara stood silently by the door, her gaze fixed on the bustling street outside. Her hope was beginning to curdle back into despair. These people were not going to help her. She was invisible. It was then that she saw him. He was across the street, in a dusty corral next to the livery. He was a cowboy, younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 20s. He was lean and wiry, with sun-streaked brown hair that fell across his forehead as he worked. He moved with a quiet, fluid grace, calming a skittish-looking chestnut mare with a low voice and a steady hand on its neck. He wasn't loud or boastful like the other cowboys who swaggered along the boardwalk. There was a stillness about him, a self-contained confidence that was magnetic. As Clara watched, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her dress, a small, lace-edged handkerchief slipped from her grasp. It was her last memento of her mother, the one she kept tucked in her sleeve. A gust of wind, born from a passing wagon, caught it and sent it tumbling into the dusty street. Before she could even think to move, the young cowboy had vaulted over the corral fence with an easy grace. He took 2 long strides and bent to retrieve the small square of white cloth from the dirt. He dusted it off gently with his thumb and looked up, his eyes searching for its owner. His gaze met hers across the street. His eyes were a startling shade of blue, the color of a deep lake under a summer sky. And in them, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she saw simple, uncomplicated kindness. There was no appraisal, no ownership, no lust. There was only a man who had seen a lady drop her handkerchief and had picked it up for her. The moment stretched, timeless and silent, a pocket of peace in the chaotic street. A faint, hesitant smile touched Clara's lips. Her heart, which she thought had turned to stone, gave a painful, hopeful flutter. He started to walk toward her, holding the handkerchief out. The spell was shattered by Silas's harsh voice at her side. "What are you gawking at?" He had finished his business. He followed her gaze and saw the cowboy approaching. His face darkened with a swift, ugly jealousy. Luke Callahan reached the edge of the boardwalk and offered the handkerchief to Clara. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. Before she could take it, Silas's hand shot out and snatched it from Luke's fingers. "We'll take that," he snarled, stuffing the delicate fabric into his own pocket as if it were a dirty rag. He grabbed Clara's arm again, his fingers digging into the flesh above her elbow. "Let's go. We're done here." Luke's expression shifted instantly. The easy friendliness in his eyes was replaced by a hard, watchful stillness. His gaze flickered from Silas's cruel grip to the flash of pain on Clara's face, then back again. He saw her wince as Silas jerked her away, pulling her along the boardwalk like a sack of grain. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The contempt in his eyes was plain to see. He watched them go, his jaw tight, until they disappeared into the wagon at the end of the street. He had seen more than a rude old man and a young woman. He had seen a jailer and his prisoner. The ride back to the farm was silent and heavy. Silas radiated a simmering anger, and Clara was too lost in her own thoughts to care. The pain in her arm was a dull throb, but it was nothing compared to the turmoil in her heart. That brief exchange, the blue eyes, the gentle voice, the simple act of courtesy, had reawakened a part of her she thought was dead. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, this sliver of hope. She closed her eyes against the harsh glare of the afternoon sun, the jostling of the wagon a grim rhythm beneath her. She must have drifted off, lulled by the monotony of the landscape, and in that half-slumber, she dreamt. Her mother was there, not as a faded memory, but vibrant and real, standing in a field of impossible bluebonnets. She was smiling, her face full of a love so pure it made Clara's heart ache.
"It hurts, Mama,"
Clara whispered in the dream. Her mother's image knelt beside her, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing on her cheek. "I know, my sweet girl, but you are stronger than this place. You are stronger than him." Her voice was a gentle echo, a melody from a half-forgotten song. Love will not find you if you believe you are worthless. Love comes when you dare to believe you are worthy of it. Clara awoke with a start as the wagon jolted to a stop in front of the grim, silent house. The dream was already fading, but the words remained, imprinted on her soul. Dare to believe you are worthy. In the face of Silas's suffocating cruelty, it felt like an impossible command. But as she looked at the angry red marks his fingers had left on her arm, a tiny, defiant spark ignited in the deepest, most hidden corner of her heart. For the first time, she did not just feel despair. She felt a flicker of rage, and she held the memory of a stranger's kind blue eyes like a secret treasure, a proof that another world, another kind of man, still existed somewhere beyond Silas Vaughn's blighted horizon. The image of the young woman's face, the brief, terrified flicker of life in her eyes before she was yanked away, stayed with Luke Callahan long after he left town. It clung to him like the fine trail dust, a persistent grit he couldn't shake. He was a man accustomed to the harshness of his world, to the casual cruelties that were as common as sagebrush. But what he had witnessed on that street, the old man's brutal ownership, the girl's silent plea, had struck a discordant chord deep inside him. That evening, he found himself in the lamplit haze of the Longhorn Saloon, nursing a lukewarm beer. The air was thick with the smell of stale smoke, sweat, and spilled whiskey. He wasn't much for drinking or idle talk, but saloons were the public ledgers of small towns, places where stories were traded like currency. He found a spot at the far end of the bar, near an old trapper named Elias, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard years. "See, Silas Vaughn was in town today," Luke said, his voice casual as he rolled a cigarette. Elias spat a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Yep, the old buzzard. Comes in for supplies every few months. Looks like he got himself a new one." Luke's posture didn't change, but his attention sharpened. "A new one?" "His wife," Elias clarified, wiping his mouth with the back of a leathery hand. "Mail order girl. The last one. She ran off about a year ago. Or so he says. Some say she's buried out on his land somewhere." He took a long drink of his whiskey. "This new one, she's just a child. Saw him myself. Jebediah Miller's girl, from down in Dry Hollow. Heard he traded her straight up for a half-decent cow and a pouch of tobacco." The words landed in the pit of Luke's stomach like stones. A cow. The casual, matter-of-fact way Elias spoke of the transaction was more sickening than any outright villainy. This wasn't a secret. It was common knowledge, a piece of local gossip. He looked around the saloon, at the men playing poker, at the bartender wiping down the bar. They all knew, and none of them did a damn thing. "It ain't right," Luke said, the words low and hard. Elias shrugged, his gaze distant. "The world is how it is. Son, a man's wife is his property, same as his horse or his land. Ain't our place to meddle in his affairs." But it was Luke's place. He just hadn't known it until now. The trapper's words, meant to be pragmatic, instead stoked the embers of a much older fire within him. He pushed his beer away, the taste suddenly foul, and walked out into the cool night air. He leaned against a porch post, the noise from the saloon fading behind him, and the memory he spent most of his life trying to bury rose to the surface, as vivid and painful as the day it was seared into his mind. He was a boy of 10, hidden in the shadows of the barn, watching through a crack in the boards. His father, a man made mean by failure and whiskey, had been yelling at his mother. The argument was over something trivial, a meal that was cold, a shirt that wasn't mended. But the reason was never the point. The point was power. The point was submission. His mother, a quiet, gentle woman with eyes the same color as Clara's, had finally talked back. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, and for that, his father had struck her. Luke could still see the way she fell, could still hear the sickening sound of the blow, could still feel the helpless, white-hot rage that had flooded his small body. He had wanted to burst out of the barn, to throw himself at his father, to do something, but he had been frozen by fear. He had done nothing but watch as his mother picked herself up, a line of blood trickling from her lip, her spirit a little more broken than it had been before. He had never forgiven his father, and he had never forgiven himself for doing nothing. That night, looking up at the indifferent stars, Luke Callahan made a silent vow. He would not stand by and do nothing again. Back at the Vaughn homestead, Clara fought to keep the walls from closing in. She performed her duties with a mechanical precision, her body moving through the familiar rhythms of cooking and cleaning while her mind retreated to a safe, numb distance. She learned to make her face a blank mask, to keep her eyes downcast, to never show the fear or the loathing that churned inside her. To show emotion was to show weakness, and weakness was an invitation for Silas to exert his power. But in the quiet moments, the despair was a physical ache. She would stand on the porch, gazing at the distant, hazy line of the mountains, and her heart would feel as barren as the land stretched before her. Her mother's words from the dream, "Dare to believe you are worthy," seemed like a cruel mockery. How could she believe she was worthy of love when her own father had sold her for livestock? How could she feel worthy of anything when every waking moment was spent in the shadow of a man who saw her as less than human? Her eyes, once bright with the dreams of youth, grew hollow, the light within them dimming a little more with each passing day. The breaking point came on a night when the sky itself seemed to be weeping. A cold, relentless autumn rain began to fall in the late afternoon, turning the dusty yard into a sea of mud. The wind howled around the corners of the house, rattling the window panes like angry spirits. Silas had spent the day in town and returned well after dark, smelling of cheap whiskey and foul temper. He stumbled into the house, shaking the rain from his coat, his face flushed with drink and a simmering rage. He was angry about the price of feed, angry about a fence that needed mending, angry at the world, and Clara was the nearest, safest target for his fury. He ate the supper she had kept warm for him in sullen silence, his eyes fixed on her with a predatory intensity that made her blood run cold. When he was done, he shoved his plate away and stood up, his bulk looming in the flickering lamplight. "Enough of this foolishness," he slurred, his voice thick and menacing. "You've had months to get settled. The waiting is over." He started toward her, a grotesque parody of a husband approaching his wife. The pretense of civility, thin as it was gone. All that remained was raw, ugly appetite. Clara backed away, her chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor.
No,
she whispered, her voice trembling.
Please, don't.
Her plea only seemed to amuse him.
Don't?
I bought and paid for you, girl. You're mine. You'll do as you're told. He lunged, grabbing her arm. His grip was like a vice. She struggled, but he was immensely strong, his whiskey-fueled strength overwhelming her. He began to drag her toward the stairs. Panic, absolute and blinding, erupted inside her. This was it, the moment she had dreaded every single night. But mixed with the terror was the spark of rage that had been kindled that day in town. It flared into a blazing inferno. Her free hand scrabbled across the table behind her, searching for a weapon. Her fingers closed around the smooth, cool glass of the oil lamp. Without a second thought, she swung it with all her might. The heavy glass base connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. Silas roared, more in surprise than in pain, and his grip on her arm loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She wrenched herself free and ran. She didn't think about where she was going. She just ran. She threw open the front door and plunged out into the maelstrom of the night. The cold was a shocking, violent slap. The rain, driven by the wind, was like needles against her skin. She wore only her thin cotton dress and was barefoot. The mud sucked at her feet, cold and slick, trying to pull her down. She stumbled and scrambled across the yard, her only thought to put distance between herself and the house. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw the front door thrown open. Silas silhouetted in the rectangle of yellow light, clutching his head and shouting curses into the storm. She fled toward the dark, jagged line of the woods that bordered the property. Thorns and sharp stones she couldn't see in the darkness tore at the soles of her feet, but she barely felt the pain. The fear was a living thing, a beast with claws and teeth at her back. The forest swallowed her whole. It was a terrifying world of absolute blackness, punctuated by brilliant, momentary flashes of lightning. In those brief, stark illuminations, the trees became twisted, grasping monsters. The wind shrieked through the branches, sounding like a chorus of damned souls. The rain fell in sheets, plastering her thin dress to her body, leaching all the warmth from her. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its lonely, predatory cry answered by the wail of the wind. She imagined snakes coiled under the wet leaves, their bodies cold and slick like the mud. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs were trembling uncontrollably. She tripped and fell, her hands and knees scraping against the rocky ground. But she scrambled back up and pushed on, sobbing and gasping for breath. Blood from the cuts on her feet mingled with the mud. Finally, she could run no more. Her body, pushed far beyond its limits, simply gave out. She stumbled against the massive trunk of a pine tree and slid down its rough bark into a heap on the sodden ground. The cold was a deep, invasive thing now, sinking into her bones. Her shivering became convulsive, then began to subside into a dangerous numbness. The terrifying sounds of the forest faded, replaced by a dull roaring in her ears. Her last conscious thought was of her mother's face, smiling in a field of blue bonnets. Then the darkness claimed her. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale, watery sun. Luke Callahan rode through the woods, his eyes scanning the ground. One of his new fillies had been spooked by the storm and had broken through a weak spot in the corral fence. He was tracking her, his gaze expert as he followed the trail of snapped twigs and hoofprints in the damp earth. He was a few miles from his own small cabin, on land that bordered the sprawling Vaughn property. As he rounded a thicket of tangled brush, he saw a patch of color that didn't belong, a pale scrap of fabric against the dark. Wet earth at the base of a large pine. He reined in his horse, his brow furrowed. He dismounted and walked closer, his boots sinking into the soft ground. It was her, the girl from town. She was lying in a crumpled heap, her face ashen, her lips blue with cold. Her hair was matted with leaves and mud, and her simple dress was torn and filthy. Her bare feet were a mess of cuts and bruises. For a terrifying moment, he thought she was dead. Then he saw the faint, shallow flutter of her chest. A surge of protective fury washed over him, so intense it was dizzying. He knelt beside her, gently brushing the wet hair from her face. Her skin was like ice. He stripped off his heavy canvas jacket and wrapped it around her small, still form, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. She was so light. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, cradling her against his chest, trying to force some of his own warmth into her frozen body. He urged his horse toward home, his mind racing. He didn't know the whole story, but he knew enough. He knew she had been running for her life. His cabin was a small, sturdy structure he had built with his own hands. Nestled in a high meadow with a view of the mountains, it was his sanctuary. He carried her inside and laid her gently on his own cot by the hearth. He worked quickly, his movements deft and sure. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, adding kindling and logs until a cheerful, crackling fire blazed, filling the small room with warmth and light. He found an old, soft flannel shirt of his and, with as much modesty as he could manage, removed her wet, muddy dress and wrapped her in the warm, dry cloth. He filled a kettle with water and put it on to boil, then examined her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle. He carefully cleaned the cuts and scrapes with a warm, damp cloth, his lips a thin, hard line of anger at the sight of her injuries. He brewed a thin broth and sat by her side, waiting. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, streaming through the cabin's single window. Clara stirred, a low moan escaping her lips. Her eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, she was lost, her mind a confusing haze of darkness and terror. Then, her vision cleared. She wasn't in the cold, dark forest. She was in a small, warm room, wrapped in a soft blanket, the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee in the air. She turned her head slowly. He was sitting in a chair beside the cot. Watching her, it was him, the cowboy from town. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was one of quiet concern. She looked into his eyes, his deep, lake blue eyes, and for the first time in her life, as she looked at a man, she saw no hunger, no calculation, no hint of ownership. All she saw was a gentle, steady light. All she saw was kindness. Waking was a slow, painful process, like a swimmer rising from a great and suffocating depth. For the first few moments, Clara was adrift in a sea of confusion. Her only reality, the rhythmic pounding in her head and the profound, aching exhaustion in her limbs. The terror of the forest, of the storm, of the flight from Silas, was still a fresh wound in her mind. She expected to open her eyes to the cold, dripping darkness of the woods. Instead, she saw the gentle, dancing light of a fire reflecting off a low, timbered ceiling. She was lying on a narrow cot, tucked under a thick wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke and clean pine. The air was warm and still. A few feet away, sitting in a simple wooden chair, was the cowboy from town. He was watching the fire, his profile etched by the flames. But she knew, with a primal certainty, that he was aware of her every breath. Her body went rigid. Every instinct screamed asterisk trap asterisk. This was just a different kind of cage, a warmer one. Perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. Her mind, honed by months of vigilance, began to catalog the room. The door was closed, but unlatched. There was a window over a small washstand. On the mantelpiece above the fire sat a heavy iron poker. Her eyes darted from the poker to the man, assessing the distance, calculating her chances. She was weak, her body a symphony of aches, but fear was a potent fuel. He must have sensed the shift in her, the sudden tension in the air. He turned his head slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. His lake blue eyes met hers, and he held her gaze for a moment before speaking. "Easy now," he said, his voice the same low, calm baritone she remembered. "You're safe here." The words meant nothing to her. She had heard words of assurance before, and they had always been lies. Safety was not a place. It was a fleeting moment between disasters. She tried to push herself up, a wave of dizziness washing over her, but her muscles refused to cooperate. He made no move to help her, a fact for which she was profoundly grateful. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. "You were half frozen out there," he continued. "You've been sleeping for most of a day. There's some broth on the stove when you feel up to it." He stood up, and her muscles coiled, ready to spring, but he only walked to the far side of the small cabin, putting as much distance between them as possible. He picked up a leather-bound book from a small shelf. "My name is Luke Callahan." he said, his back still to her. "You can stay as long as you need to get your strength back. No one will bother you." For the next few days, Clara lived in a state of suspended terror. She was a wild, cornered thing, expecting a blow that never came. Luke was true to his word. He never approached her cot, never asked her a single question, never even looked at her for too long. He moved with a quiet economy, tending to the fire, cooking simple meals of beans and bacon, the smell of which made her stomach ache with a hunger she hadn't realized she possessed. He would leave a plate of food and a tin cup of water on a small stool near the fire, then retreat to his chair or go outside to tend to his horses, leaving her alone to eat. She watched his every move from under the relative safety of her blanket. She watched the way his hands were gentle as he groomed his horse. She watched the way he would stand at the window in the evening, staring out at the mountains, a deep, abiding loneliness in his posture. He was a man wrapped in a profound stillness, and slowly, cautiously, a part of her began to believe that his stillness was not a predator's patience, but a quiet strength. He never mentioned Silas. He never asked where she had come from or why she was running barefoot through a storm. His silence was the greatest gift he could have given her, for it allowed the frantic, terrified voice in her head to slowly quiet down. It gave her space to simply be, to let her battered body and bruised soul begin the slow, arduous process of healing. On the fourth day, she felt strong enough to stand. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, her bare feet touching the cool, smooth planks of the floor. She was wearing a man's flannel shirt that hung on her like a tent, but it was warm and clean. Her own dress, washed and mended, was folded neatly on the chair where he had been sitting. The simple act of care was so foreign, so unexpected. It brought a lump to her throat. When Luke came back inside, he found her standing by the fire, awkwardly holding the plate he had left for her. He stopped in the doorway, giving her space. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she did not immediately look away.
"Thank you,"
she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "You're welcome." That small exchange broke the seal of silence. The tension in the cabin didn't disappear, but it lessened, changing from the sharp edge of fear to the duller ache of uncertainty. A week after she had woken up in his cabin, they were sitting on opposite sides of the hearth as the evening closed in. The fire crackled and spat, a cheerful counterpoint to the heavy silence between them. Clara had been turning her story over and over in her mind, the ugly, shameful facts of it. She felt a desperate need to tell him, to make him understand. She had to know if the kindness in his eyes would curdle into pity or, worse, contempt, once he knew the truth of what she was. "My father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She stared into the flames, unable to look at him. She faltered, the words catching in her throat. Luke remained silent, waiting. He did not prompt her, did not rush her. He simply gave her the space to find her voice.
"He traded me,"
she finally managed to say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth.
"To Silas Vaughn, for a cow."
She said it all then, the whole sordid story. She spoke of her father's drunken cruelty, of the mail order advertisement, of her mother's wedding dress. She told him of Silas's cold, possessive eyes, of the locked barn, of the constant fear, and finally, of the night in the storm. The words poured out of her in a raw, halting torrent, a confession and a plea all in one. When she was finished, she fell silent, her body trembling, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. She braced herself for his judgment. She risked a glance at him. He was looking at her, his blue eyes clear and steady. There was no pity in them, no disgust. There was only a deep, quiet anger. An anger directed not at her, but at the world that had done this to her. He was quiet for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Then he spoke, his voice low and certain. "It was not your fault," he said, 3 simple words, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the thick, icy wall of shame she had built around her heart. Asterisk. It was not your fault. No one had ever said that to her before. Her father had blamed her for being another mouth to feed. Silas had blamed her for not being a sufficiently obedient possession. She had blamed herself for being weak, for not fighting harder, for simply existing. In that moment, with those 3 words, Luke Callahan gave her back a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. Tears she hadn't been able to shed in her terror now streamed down her face, hot and cleansing, and for the first time since her mother had died, she didn't feel completely alone. The days found a new rhythm after that. The fear receded, replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. She began to help him with small chores around the cabin, her movements still shy and uncertain. He taught her how to properly bank the fire at night and how to recognize the tracks of deer in the woods. They spoke more, sharing small, careful pieces of themselves. She learned he had come from East Texas, that he preferred the solitude of the mountains to the noise of towns, and that he was saving to buy a piece of land and raise horses of his own. One afternoon, they were out in the high meadow, walking back from the spring where they got their water. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, had turned a bruised purple-gray on the horizon. A sudden, cold wind swept down from the peaks, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. "Storm's coming in fast," Luke said, his eyes on the churning clouds. "We need to get back." They had barely made it to the edge of the meadow when the sky opened up. It wasn't a gentle rain, but a sudden, violent deluge. The rain came down in cold, hard sheets, soaking them to the skin in a matter of seconds. They ran the last 100 yards to the cabin, laughing breathlessly as they burst through the door into the relative quiet of the small room. They stood there, dripping and shivering, water pooling around their feet on the wooden floor. The sudden intimacy of the moment was palpable. The cabin, which had seemed a safe size when they kept to their own sides, now felt impossibly small. Clara was acutely aware of the way the wet flannel shirt clung to her, of the droplets of water clinging to his eyelashes, of the heat radiating from his body. "Get by the fire," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. He grabbed 2 thick wool blankets from a nearby chest. She went to the hearth, holding her trembling hands out to the flames. He came up behind her and draped one of the heavy blankets over her shoulders. His fingers brushed against the bare skin of her neck. An accidental, fleeting touch. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through her. It was the first time he had touched her. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was standing closer than he ever had before, his face only inches from hers. She could see the firelight reflected in the deep blue of his eyes. The world seemed to fall away, the roar of the storm outside fading to a distant hum. She didn't know who moved first. It didn't matter. It was a moment of pure, unthinking instinct, a collision of 2 lonely souls who had been starved of warmth for too long. His lips met hers, and the kiss was nothing like she had ever imagined a kiss could be. It wasn't gentle or sweet. It was desperate, clumsy, and raw with unspoken need. It was the taste of rain and wood smoke and a sorrow so deep it had no name. It was trembling and uncertain, but it was also fiercely, breathtakingly alive. It was too much, too soon. The intensity of it terrified her. She broke away, stumbling back a step, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wrapped her arms around herself, the blanket falling to the floor. The old fear, the ingrained distrust of men and their desires, came rushing back.
She stammered, shaking her head. I don't know who I am anymore."
The words were a raw, honest confession of her utter confusion. She wasn't Silas's property. She wasn't just her father's daughter, but who was she? What was this feeling that was both terrifying and wonderful? Luke didn't move toward her. He stood his ground, his own breathing unsteady, his expression one of profound, aching empathy. He looked at her, This fragile, fierce girl who had survived so much, and he saw a reflection of his own broken pieces. "It's all right," he said, his voice soft. "We're both learning all over again." That night, she slept on the cot, and he took a blanket and lay down on the floor on the other side of the hearth. A thin, unbreachable wall of space separated them, but for the first time, the space was not filled with fear or silence. It was filled with a new, fragile, and utterly terrifying possibility. As they lay in the darkness, listening to the dying heartbeat of the storm, their hearts, though separated by the small room, had begun the slow, hesitant journey of reaching for each other. The kiss by the fire did not solve everything. In its wake, it left a new and shimmering awkwardness, a tension that was different from the fear that had preceded it. They moved around the small cabin with a heightened awareness of each other, their hands sometimes brushing as they reached for the same utensil, a jolt of heat passing between them that left them both flustered and silent. The single room, once a sanctuary, now seemed charged with an unspoken question. But slowly, as the days passed, this new tension softened, settling into a quiet rhythm of companionship. The work of survival was a steadying, grounding force. They fell into a partnership born of necessity, a language without words that was spoken in the shared effort of chopping wood, hauling water, and mending the fences of the horse corral. Clara found a surprising strength in her own hands, a deep satisfaction in the physical ache of a day's labor. Here, her work was not a duty performed under a tyrant's gaze, but a contribution, an act of creation in the life they were building, however temporary it might be. In the long, quiet evenings, they began to talk, not of the horrors of the past, but of the ghosts of dreams they had both thought long buried. One evening, Clara watched as Luke painstakingly read from his leather-bound book, his lips moving silently with the words, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a copy of Moby Dick *, and he stumbled over the more difficult passages. "I wish I could read like that," she confessed, her voice small. "My mother taught me my letters, but she passed before we got much further." "Pa," he said, reading was a waste of time for a girl, said it put foolish ideas in their heads. Luke looked up from his book, his expression serious. "That's not a foolish idea," he said, his voice firm. "A person's mind is their own. No one has the right to keep it locked up." The next day, he brought out a tattered primer he had kept from his own brief schooling. Using a piece of charcoal on the back of a wooden shingle, he began to teach her. They started with simple words: asterisk sun asterisk, asterisk sky asterisk, asterisk horse asterisk home asterisk. Each letter she formed, each word she sounded out, was a small act of defiance, a reclaiming of a part of herself that had been denied to her. The joy she felt when she read her first full sentence aloud, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," was a pure, brilliant thing, brighter than any fire. Luke watched her, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. He saw not a broken victim, but a woman of fierce intelligence and a resilient spirit, and his admiration for her deepened into something warmer, something more profound. In turn, she learned of his own quiet ambition. "My father," he told her one afternoon as they sat on the corral fence, watching the horses graze in the meadow. "He hated the land, said it broke a man's back and his spirit for nothing. He wanted to go to the city, get rich. He never did. He just got bitter." Luke picked up a splinter from the top rail, turning it over in his fingers. "I feel different. I look at this," he gestured to the wide-open meadow, the towering mountains, "and I feel free. I want to raise horses, not just any horses, strong ones, fast ones, the kind that have a little bit of the wildness of these mountains in them, a place where they can run." Clara listened, captivated. His dream wasn't of wealth, but of creation, of nurturing life, of building something honest and real from the earth. She saw that his stillness was not emptiness. It was a deep well of patience and a quiet, unshakable strength. His dream mirrored her own burgeoning desire to create a life that was not defined by fear, but by freedom. Their days took on a golden hue. The world outside the small mountain meadow ceased to exist. Their life was simple, stripped down to its essentials: hard work, shared meals, and growing trust. The afternoons were the best. The sun would slant through the tall pines, casting long shadows and bathing the valley in a warm, honeyed light. Luke would finish his chores, and they would saddle 2 of the horses. They would ride out into the high country, through fields of tall, whispering grass that tickled their legs, their horses' hooves a soft thud on the rich earth. The air was clean and crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the chirping of crickets. From the high ridges, they could see the whole world spread out below them, a vast, empty canvas of possibility. During these rides, a playful ease grew between them. They would race each other to the top of a hill. Clara's laughter, a sound she thought had died inside her, pealing through the clear mountain air. For the first time, she felt the simple, uncomplicated joy of being alive. She was not a possession, not a commodity, not a victim. She was just Clara, a woman on a fast horse, with the wind in her hair and a man by her side whose presence felt not like a cage, but like a shield. The unspoken tension of the kiss remained, a low hum beneath the surface of their peaceful days. There were moments, a shared glance across the dinner table, the accidental brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a tool, that were so charged with unspoken feeling they both had to look away. Clara felt a strange, new fluttering in her chest, a mixture of fear and a powerful, unfamiliar longing. With Silas, the idea of a man's touch had been a source of terror. With Luke, it was a source of deep, trembling curiosity. The change came one night, weeks into her stay. Another storm had rolled in, a gentler one this time. The rain a soft, steady drumming on the roof of the cabin. The fire burned low, casting flickering, intimate shadows on the walls. They had been sitting in comfortable silence for a long time, the day's work done. Luke was on his side of the hearth, cleaning a bridle, his hands strong and capable. Clara was on hers, sitting on the cot, her primer in her lap. Though she wasn't reading, she was watching him. She saw the loneliness in the set of his shoulders. She saw the deep-seated sadness that sometimes clouded his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw a man who had built walls around his heart just as she had. A man who had been wounded by the world and had sought refuge in solitude. And in that moment, her fear was finally eclipsed by a feeling that was stronger, deeper, and infinitely more powerful. A desire to comfort, to connect, to heal. Her heart pounded in her chest, a wild drum against her ribs. This was her choice. Not her father's, not Silas's, hers. She was terrified, but for the first time, it was a fear of her own making, born of vulnerability, not of violence. Slowly, she stood up and put her book aside. The floorboards creaked softly under her bare feet as she crossed the small space that separated them. Luke looked up, his hands stilling their work. His eyes widened slightly as he saw the look on her face, a look of profound seriousness, of quiet determination. She did not speak. She knelt in front of him and gently took the bridle from his hands, setting it on the floor. Then, she took his larger, calloused hands in her own. She looked into his eyes, and in their blue depths, she saw his own fear and his own longing reflected back at her. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. This kiss was different. There was no desperation, no clumsiness. It was soft, questioning, and full of a tenderness that made her ache. He responded in kind, his touch gentle as he raised a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin as if she were something precious, something fragile. He led her to the cot, and in the warm, flickering light of the dying fire, they came together. It was a discovery, a quiet, reverent exploration. For Luke, it was an undoing of the violence he associated with men and women, a replacement of old, ugly memories with a new and sacred one. For Clara, It was a reclamation. Every touch was an erasure of Silas's hateful gaze, every gentle whisper an answer to her father's cruel words. It was a slow, healing balm on the deepest of wounds, a confirmation that she was not a thing to be used, but a woman to be cherished. In his arms, she felt not possessed, but found. Afterward, as they lay tangled together under the warm blanket, the rain still whispering on the roof, she began to cry. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming release. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the grief she had held inside for so long finally broke free. Luke held her, his own eyes wet, and let her weep. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her to be strong. He simply held her, sharing the weight of her sorrow. His presence a silent promise that she would never have to carry it alone again. In that shared, cathartic darkness, their broken pieces began to fit together, creating something new, something whole. They awoke the next morning to a world washed clean, the sunlight streaming through the window in brilliant, dust-moted shafts. A fragile, peaceful joy filled the small cabin. Clara felt lighter than she had in years, as if she had shed a heavy, suffocating skin. She was smiling as she stoked the fire, Luke's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. For a few perfect, stolen moments, the world was just this room, just the two of them. The peace was shattered by the sound of a horse approaching at a hard gallop. They broke apart, instantly on alert. Luke moved to the door, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife he kept on his belt. A rider, a young hand from a neighboring ranch, pulled his lathered horse to a halt in the yard. His face was grim. "Luke!" he shouted, his voice urgent. "I was in town for supplies. Heard talk in the saloon. It's Silas Vaughn. He knows the girl's with you. He's gathered a few of his men. Says he's coming to collect his property. They rode out an hour ago." The words hung in the clean morning air, ugly and venomous. Asterisk his property. A cold, hard fury transformed Luke's face. The gentle man of the night before was gone, replaced by a stranger with eyes like chips of ice. This was not just about Silas. This was about his father. This was about every bully who used his strength to hurt those weaker than him. This was about the boy who had stood by and done nothing. He turned to Clara, his voice low and guttural. "Get your things, only what you can carry." He strode to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the cabin and threw it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a Winchester rifle and 2 Colt revolvers. He checked the action on the rifle, his movements swift and economical, his face a mask of cold rage. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, her voice trembling as she pulled on her boots. The beautiful, peaceful morning turned to ash in her mouth. "Higher," he said, shoving shells into his pockets. "Up into the high peaks. He knows these woods, but he doesn't know the high trails like I do. We can lose him there." He looked at her, and the fire in his eyes was terrifying and magnificent. "He is not taking you back." There was no time for sentiment, no moment for a mournful farewell to the small cabin that had been their sanctuary. The news of Silas's approach was a lit match dropped on a trail of gunpowder. Urgency, cold and sharp, propelled them into a flurry of silent, efficient motion. While Luke saddled the 2 most sure-footed horses, Clara moved through the cabin, her mind a clear, cold instrument of survival. She packed what little they could carry, a side of bacon wrapped in oilcloth, a bag of hardtack, a small sack of coffee beans, and the tin pot from Luke's stores. She took a box of matches, a sharp skinning knife, and every last cartridge of ammunition she could find. She stuffed these into 2 canvas saddlebags. There was no room for her mended dress or the precious primer. Their life was now measured in what could be carried on the back of a horse. Luke strode back inside, his face a grim mask. He slung the Winchester rifle over his back and buckled on the belt with its 2 heavy Colt revolvers, the worn leather creaking in the silent cabin. He grabbed the blankets from the cot, rolled them tightly, and tied them behind his saddle. He took one last look around the small room that had witnessed their fragile peace, then turned to her, his eyes hard. "Ready?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They rode out not in a panic, but with a grim, determined speed, pushing the horses eastward, away from the traveled paths and up into the embrace of the high peaks, the familiar woods of the lower valley, with their sun-dappled clearings and gentle streams, soon gave way to a landscape that was actively hostile. The trail, where it existed at all, became a narrow, winding ribbon of stone and dirt clinging to the sides of steep ravines. They climbed steadily, the air growing thinner and colder with every foot of elevation. By midday, they were enveloped in a thick, disorienting fog. It rolled down from the peaks without warning, a silent, gray tide that swallowed the world. The sun vanished. The horizon disappeared. Their universe shrank to a few yards of treacherous ground around them. They could see nothing but the ghostly shapes of stunted, wind-twisted pines and the slick, dark faces of the rock beside them. Luke dismounted, his hand on the bridle of his horse, and led the way on foot, his eyes fixed on the ground, reading the subtle shifts in the terrain with an instinct Clara could only marvel at. She followed close behind, the rhythmic clink of the horse's shod hooves on stone the only sound in the swirling, directionless gray. The fog muted everything, creating a sense of profound and dangerous isolation. They navigated treacherous slopes of scree, where a single misplaced step could send a cascade of loose rock skittering down into the unseen abyss below. Twice, Luke's horse lost its footing, whinnying in terror as it scrambled for purchase, its powerful muscles straining. But Luke's calm voice and steady hand soothed it, guiding it back to solid ground. Clara felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, but she pushed it down. To show fear now was a luxury she could not afford. She focused on the back of Luke's shoulders, a solid, reassuring presence in the ghostly mist, and she kept moving. As afternoon bled into a premature twilight, a new and unexpected enemy declared itself. The temperature plummeted, and the thick, wet mist began to crystallize. A fine, stinging sleet turned into thick, wet flakes of snow. It was far too early in the season for snow, a freak storm that was both a blessing and a curse. It would cover their tracks, but it also made the already treacherous path nearly invisible and leached the warmth from their bodies with a brutal efficiency. Shivering, their clothes soaked through, they finally found a marginal sort of shelter just as the last of the light failed. It was a shallow overhang on the face of a cliff, a wide, rocky ledge protected from the worst of the falling snow by the great slab of granite above. It wasn't a cave, but it was a refuge. They unsaddled the exhausted horses and tethered them at the back of the ledge, where they stood huddled together for warmth. Luke, his movements economical despite his shivering, managed to start a small, nearly smokeless fire with a handful of dry twigs he found deep in a crevice of the rock. They huddled close to the meager flames, the immense, silent darkness of the mountains all around them. The fire was a tiny spark of life in a vast, dead world of stone and snow. They gnawed on hardtack and a few strips of cold bacon, the food tasteless in their mouths, but necessary. The flight from Silas's farm had been a blind panic, a desperate scramble for survival. This was different. This was a calculated retreat, a strategic withdrawal into a fortress of wilderness. And this time, she was not alone. The knowledge was a small, warm coal in the center of her chest, a fire that the biting wind could not extinguish. She looked at Luke, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, his jaw set in a hard, determined line. The weight of their survival was on his shoulders, and he bore it without complaint. A wave of feeling so powerful it was almost painful washed over her. Gratitude, admiration, and a fierce, protective love. They slept in shifts, while Luke took the first watch, sitting with the Winchester across his lap, his back against the rock wall. Clara huddled under both blankets, trying to find a warmth that wasn't there. But sleep, when it came, offered no escape. It was a dark, suffocating place, filled with echoes and shadows. She was running again, not through the woods, but through an endless, muddy field under a bruised and starless sky. The mud was thick and cold, pulling at her bare feet, trying to drag her down. And behind her, she could hear them. The voices, they twisted together, a monstrous chorus of torment. Silas's guttural rasp, calling her property, his girl, his purchase. And underneath it, her father's wheezing slur, counting out the price of a cow, telling her she was worthless, a burden he was glad to be rid of. In the dream, she could feel their hands on her, grabbing, pulling, Silas's rough, gnarled fingers digging into her arm, her father's whiskey-sour breath on her face. She was being dragged back to the dark house, back to the shack in Dry Hollow. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The terror was a physical thing. A hand clamped over her throat, choking the air from her lungs. She awoke with a violent gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat despite the freezing air. She was thrashing, tangled in the blankets, her heart hammering against her ribs as if it would break free. The dream clung to her like a shroud, the foul echo of the voices still ringing in her ears. "Clara!" Luke's voice cut through the fog of her terror, low and steady. He was kneeling beside her, his hand on her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. "It was just a dream," he said softly. "I can't," she sobbed, the words torn from her. "I can't get away from them. Their voices, they're always there." She was shaking uncontrollably, the nightmare more real than the cold stone beneath her. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply tightened his grip on her shoulder, forcing her to meet his eyes in the dim, flickering light of the fire. The gaze he fixed on her was one of absolute, unwavering certainty. "Listen to me," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet intensity that commanded her attention. "You ran from them. You fought them. You survived them. That life is over. That darkness is behind you." He leaned closer, his blue eyes boring into hers. "You don't belong to that darkness anymore." His words were a shield, a bulwark against the ghosts of her past. He pulled her into his arms, wrapping the blankets tightly around her, and held her against his chest. She buried her face in the rough wool of his coat, breathing in the scent of smoke and pine and him. She cried, not in terror this time, but in a wrenching, sorrowful release. He held her without a word, his strength flowing into her, until the shaking subsided and her ragged breaths evened out. He was right. She did not belong to them. She belonged here, with him. They remained on that high ledge for 3 days, trapped by the storm. They lived a stark, elemental existence, their world reduced to the confines of the rock shelter. Luke proved to be a master of the wilderness. He set snares and caught 2 rabbits, which they roasted over the fire. The meat, a welcome relief from the dry hardtack. He showed her how to melt the snow for drinking water, how to read the clouds to predict the weather. Their conversations were sparse, their energy conserved for survival, but in the quiet moments, a new and deeper intimacy grew between them, more profound than any passion. It was in the way he would pass her the last piece of roasted meat, the way she would repack the bandages on his hands where the rocks had scraped them, the way they would huddle together under the blankets for warmth, their bodies a shared defense against the relentless cold. They were no longer just a man and a woman who had found solace in each other's arms. They were partners, a unit, their lives inextricably woven together by the shared threat and the shared will to live. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, their shared glances and small, unconscious gestures speaking volumes in the vast, silent wilderness. On the 4th morning, they awoke to a world transformed. The storm had broken, and the sky was a brilliant, achingly clear blue. The snow had stopped, and a blanket of pristine white covered everything, sparkling under the bright, cold sun. The view from their ledge was breathtaking. They were perched high above the world, looking out over a sea of jagged, snow-dusted peaks that stretched to the horizon. It was a landscape of savage, intimidating beauty, a place where humans were small and insignificant. "It's over," Clara whispered, her breath misting in the frigid air.
"The snow will have covered our trail completely."
Luke didn't answer immediately. He was standing at the very edge of the ledge, his body silhouetted against the bright sky, his gaze sweeping the valley far below. His eyes, accustomed to the vast distances of the plains, were sharp and discerning. He froze, his body going unnaturally still.
"What is it?"
Clara asked, a fresh spike of fear piercing their fragile peace. He didn't turn. He just raised his arm and pointed. "Down there," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "By the creek bed." She moved to stand beside him, her eyes following the line of his arm. At first, she saw nothing but the endless, blinding white. Then she saw it. Far below, barely visible against the snow, was a series of dark specks moving in a single-file line. They were too deliberate, too orderly to be deer or elk. They were horses, shod horses, picking their way carefully through the drifts. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. They were not lost. They were hunting, and they were moving in the right direction. Silas had not given up. He was coming. The sight of the dark figures moving against the pristine snow was like a drop of poison in clean water. It contaminated the brief, beautiful peace of the morning, turning the savage beauty of the landscape into a cage from which there was no escape. Clara felt a familiar, icy dread seep into her bones, the cold of the mountain air suddenly insignificant compared to the winter in her soul. Her first instinct, ingrained and powerful, was to run, to climb higher, to find a deeper shadow, to simply vanish into the unforgiving wilderness. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice tight, grabbing Luke's arm. "We can get a head start. The snow is deep. It will slow them down." Luke didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the valley below. His eyes narrowed into slits of cold, hard focus. The man who had held her so tenderly through the night was gone, replaced by something older and harder, a figure carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, a stone dropping into a deep well. "No more running." He turned to face her then, and she saw the profound, weary finality in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had been running his entire life, from his father's ghost, from his own helplessness, from the memory of a boy hiding in a barn, and had finally reached the end of the trail. "This doesn't end by running, Clara," he said, his voice low and raw with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "A life spent looking over your shoulder isn't a life. It's just a slower way to die. It ends here, today, one way or another." His words extinguished the frantic, panicked fluttering in her chest, replacing it with a cold, terrifying calm. He was right. Running had only brought them here. To the edge of the world. There was nowhere left to run. The descent was a slow, deliberate retreat from the heavens. They did not rush. They moved with a grim purpose, guiding the horses down the treacherous, snow-covered slope. It was a journey back into the world of men, a world of violence and consequence. With every step downward, Clara could feel the thin, clean air of the peaks being replaced by the thicker, heavier atmosphere of the valley, an air that seemed charged with impending violence. Luke did not lead them back the way they had come. He cut across the face of the mountain, moving toward a small, sheltered basin he knew, a place where a stand of aspens ringed a flat, snow-dusted meadow. It was a natural arena, a place where there would be no ambush, no surprises, a place for a final reckoning. They reached it an hour later and tethered the horses deep within the skeletal, white-barked trees. Luke checked his weapons, the metallic clicks of the rifle's lever and the revolver's cylinders spinning, sounding unnaturally loud in the profound silence. He turned to Clara, his face a mask of stone. "Stay with the horses," he commanded. "No matter what you hear, you stay here. Do you understand?" She wanted to argue, to scream that she would not hide while he faced them alone. But she saw the look in his eyes and knew it was useless. This was his fight, a battle he had been waiting to wage for a lifetime. She gave a single, jerky nod, her heart a cold, heavy lump in her chest. He walked out into the center of the clearing and waited. He stood alone in the vast whiteness, a solitary, dark figure against the snow, the Winchester held loosely in his hands. He looked small and terribly vulnerable. It wasn't a long wait. Soon, she heard the crunch of hooves on snow, the jingle of harness, the low murmur of men's voices. 4 riders emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. Silas Vaughn was in the lead, his stooped frame perched on a large, powerful black horse. He was flanked by 2 hired men, rough-looking drifters with cold eyes and rifles held ready across their saddles. A 4th man, younger and more nervous-looking, hung back slightly. They pulled up about 30 yards from Luke, their horses stamping and snorting, their breath pluming in the frigid air. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence of the high country pressed in on them, broken only by the sighing of the wind through the bare aspen branches. Silas broke the silence, his voice a gravelly sneer that cut through the clean air. "Callahan, I knew I'd find you. You've got something that belongs to me." His cold, slate-gray eyes scanned the trees, searching for her. "Give me the girl, and I'll let you walk away from this." "She's not a stray calf you've come to collect." "Vaughn," Luke called back, his voice steady and clear, echoing slightly in the basin. "She's a free woman. Her name is Clara." Silas let out a short, ugly bark of a laugh. "Her name is whatever I say it is. I have a contract, signed by her father, paid for with a good cow. The law is on my side. She is my property." "There's a higher law than the kind you buy with a cow," Luke said, his voice dropping, becoming harder. "One that says you don't put your hands on another person in anger, one that says you don't treat a woman like a slave." He took a half-step forward. "You broke that law, and now you have to answer for it. Not to them." He gestured with his rifle toward the hired men. "But to me." A flicker of something, unease, perhaps even fear, crossed Silas's face. He had expected to deal with a frightened boy, not this cold, determined man. "You're a fool," Silas spat. "There are 3 of us with rifles." "They're working for wages," Luke countered, his gaze sweeping over the 2 hard-faced men. "I doubt you're paying them enough to die for you today. This is between you and me. Vaughn, a man's dispute. Let's settle it like men." It was a classic Western challenge, an appeal to a code of honor that was already ancient and half forgotten. But in this place, far from the reach of sheriffs and judges, it was the only law that mattered. The 2 hired men exchanged a nervous glance. They had signed on to intimidate a runaway girl, not to get into a stand-up gunfight with a man who looked like he knew how to use the rifle in his hands. Silas, trapped by the public challenge, his pride on the line, felt his options narrowing, his face twisted into a mask of pure malevolence. "Fine," he snarled. "You want to settle it? We'll settle it." He dismounted heavily, pulling a large dragoon revolver from a holster on his saddle. He was clumsy and slow compared to Luke's fluid grace. He stomped out into the snow, his face flushed with rage. 10 paces, Silas rasped, his eyes burning with hate. "On the count of 3. Luke didn't move. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. From her hiding place in the trees, Clara watched, her hand clamped over her mouth to keep from screaming. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare of cold steel and colder fury. The world had shrunk to this white, silent arena, to the 2 men standing 30 feet apart, their lives balanced on a razor's edge. Silas began to walk, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. Luke stood his ground, letting the old man pace off the distance. 1, Silas counted, his voice tight. Clara saw it before Luke did. Silas had no intention of a fair fight. There was no honor in him, only a venomous need to win, to destroy. 2! Silas barked, and as the word left his lips, he spun, his revolver already coming up, his thumb pulling back the hammer. He fired before the word 3 could even form in his throat. The shot was a deafening crack that shattered the mountain silence, a sound of profound and irreversible violence. It echoed off the high rock walls, sending a flurry of snow cascading from a nearby pine branch. A flock of birds, startled from their perch, exploded into the air. Luke cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain and surprise. He staggered back a step, the Winchester slipping from his grasp and falling into the snow. A dark stain, shocking in its suddenness, blossomed on the thick canvas of his jacket, high on his left shoulder. For a single, frozen heartbeat, the world stood still. Then, a raw, primal scream was torn from Clara's throat, a sound of pure agony and rage. The sound broke the spell of her fear, shattering the paralysis that had held her. She was no longer a victim. She was a vessel of pure, protective fury. Without a thought, she lunged for the horse where Luke had left his gun belt slung over the saddle horn. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the leather, pulling one of the heavy Colt revolvers free. It was shockingly heavy, a cold, brutal weight in her hand. She burst from the cover of the trees, running into the clearing, the gun held out in front of her in a shaking, two-handed grip. Silas was walking toward Luke's fallen form, a triumphant, demonic smirk on his face, his own pistol still smoking. He hadn't even registered her presence until she screamed his name. Vaughn. He stopped and turned, his smirk dissolving into stunned disbelief as he saw her, this scrawny, terrified girl, standing there, leveling a revolver at his chest. "I am not a cow!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with the force of her emotion. The words she had longed to say, the truth she had finally claimed, poured out of her. "I am not your property. You cannot buy me again." The hired men, shocked by the turn of events, raised their own rifles uncertainly, but before anyone could move, the sound of more horses, ridden hard, echoed from the trail leading into the basin. A moment later, a half-dozen riders appeared. It was the town sheriff, a grim-faced man with a shotgun, and a posse of ranchers and townsmen, their faces a mixture of curiosity and alarm. One of them, a white-haired man in the black coat of a preacher, spurred his horse forward. It was Reverend Miller, a man whose moral authority in the county was absolute. He took in the scene at a glance. Luke on the ground, clutching his shoulder, Silas with a smoking gun, and Clara, a figure of avenging fury, holding them all at bay. "Silas Vaughn!" the Reverend boomed, his voice like the wrath of God. "What is the meaning of this?" "She is my wife, my property!" Silas shouted, his composure finally breaking. "He stole her from me. The law is on my side." The Reverend's eyes, full of a righteous fire, fell upon Clara, then upon the blood staining the snow around Luke. "The law of man is a fragile thing, Silas," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "But God's law is eternal, and God does not permit a man to treat a woman, a child of God, as you have treated this girl. We have heard the stories. We have been blind for too long." The sheriff dismounted, his shotgun leveled at Silas's chest. "Drop the gun! Silas, it's over!" He then turned to the two hired guns. "You two as well. We found a stash of illegal army rifles in your wagon on the way up here. Seems you've been doing more than ranching lately." Silas's face went slack, the color draining from it. The final pieces of his cruel world were crumbling around him. The younger of his men, seeing the tables had turned, spoke up, his voice quavering. "He told us he'd kill her if she didn't come back peaceful. He's done it before. Years back, his first wife. He told everyone she ran off." It was over. The web of fear and intimidation Silas had woven for years had finally torn apart. He dropped his revolver into the snow with a soft thud. Clara didn't watch them take him away. The moment the threat was gone, The adrenaline that had fueled her drained away, leaving her weak and trembling. The heavy revolver slipped from her numb fingers. She ran to Luke's side, falling to her knees in the blood-stained snow. He was pale, his teeth gritted in pain, but he was conscious. "Clara," he breathed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Don't talk," she said, her hands shaking as she tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat to press against the wound. "Just be still." She worked quickly, her mind clear, her hands surprisingly steady. The blood stained her fingers, warm and sticky, but she felt no revulsion. She was a healer now, a protector. Luke reached up with his good hand, his fingers brushing her cheek. He looked at her, his blue eyes clouded with pain but filled with an emotion so deep, so full of love and pride. It took her breath away. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. "I promised," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I promised I'd protect you." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. "You did," she whispered back, her voice thick. "We protected each other." She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. The world and its noise fading away until there was nothing left but the two of them, alive, together, in the vast, silent heart of the mountains. The journey down from the mountain was a slow, agonizing procession. Luke, pale and feverish, drifted in and out of consciousness, his head resting against Clara's back as she guided his horse. The sheriff and his posse formed a protective escort, their grim silence a testament to the gravity of the day's events. Silas and his men were bound and led behind, their era of quiet tyranny brought to a sudden, public end. They did not take Luke back to his isolated cabin, but to the small, clean room above the doctor's office in town. For weeks, that room became Clara's entire world. The bullet had shattered part of Luke's collarbone, and the wound, like most gunshot wounds, was a dirty, angry thing, prone to infection. The first few days were critical. A fever took hold, plunging Luke into a delirium where he wrestled with the ghosts of his past, calling out for his mother, his words a tangled, heartbroken litany of a pain he had carried in silence for years. Clara never left his side. She was a fierce, tireless guardian, her small frame belying a strength she had never known she possessed. She bathed his face with cool water, spooned thin broth and bitter herbal remedies between his cracked lips, and changed the bandages on his wound with a steady hand, her stomach churning at the sight but her resolve never wavering. The doctor, a kind, weary man named Josiah Miller, showed her how to clean the wound and what to look for. He was amazed by her dedication. Most women would faint at the sight of it, he told her one evening. "You, child, you have steel in your spine." Clara didn't feel like steel. She felt like a frayed thread, stretched to its breaking point, but every time she looked at Luke's still, pale face, she found a new reservoir of strength. She would sit by his bedside for hours in the dim lamplight, holding his hand, her touch a constant, reassuring presence. She spoke to him in a low, soft voice, telling him about the horses in the livery, the weather, the small bits of town gossip she overheard. She read to him from his own worn copy of *Moby Dick*, her voice growing stronger and more confident with every page. Her own literacy a gift he had given her, which she was now returning to him in his darkness. During that time, something shifted in the town of Harmony Creek. The story of what had happened in the mountains spread like a grass fire. It was a story of shocking brutality, but also of incredible courage. Clara, the silent, haunted girl who had been bought for a cow, was suddenly seen in a new light. She was the woman who had faced down Silas Vaughn with a revolver in her hand. The women of the town, who had once averted their eyes in a mixture of pity and fear, now sought her out. The sheriff's wife, a formidable woman named Martha, would bring by baskets of fresh bread and stew. Others would leave bundles of clean linens or jars of preserves outside the doctor's door. They were small offerings, but they were gestures of solidarity, a silent apology for their collective blindness. They saw in Clara not a piece of property, but a reflection of their own struggles, their own fears, and a symbol of a strength they hoped they would possess in the face of such darkness. After 3 long weeks, the fever broke. One morning, Clara awoke in her chair to find Luke watching her, his eyes clear for the first time. The deep blue was no longer clouded with pain, but filled with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. He couldn't speak much, his throat raw, but his gaze said everything. He squeezed her hand, and in that simple, weak pressure, she felt the promise of their future. His recovery was slow, measured in agonizing inches. The first time he sat up, the first time he stood on trembling legs, the first time he walked the length of the room leaning on her for support, each was a monumental victory. Through it all, Clara was his constant shadow, his nurse, his strength. In caring for his broken body, she healed the last of her own broken spirit. The fear that had lived in her bones for so long was replaced by a fierce, protective love. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was the architect of her own life, and the center of that life was the quiet, resilient man who was slowly, painstakingly, coming back to her. By the time the last of the snow had melted from the high peaks and the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the cold, hard ground, Luke was nearly whole again. His shoulder would always carry a scar, a knot of raised tissue that would ache when the weather turned cold, a permanent reminder of the price they had paid. But his step was steady, his arm was strong, and his eyes, when he looked at Clara, held a love so profound it was a tangible thing. One bright Sunday morning, they walked hand in hand to the small white church at the edge of town. Luke wore a clean shirt and his best trousers. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton. It had been left for her the day before, a gift from the women of the church. They had pieced it together from their own sewing baskets, each woman contributing a bit of thread, a length of lace, a row of careful stitches. It was more beautiful to her than any silk or satin, a garment woven from kindness and respect. They stood before Reverend Miller, the same man who had borne witness in the mountains, and spoke their vows. Their voices were quiet but steady in the sunlit church. There was no grand celebration, only a handful of townspeople in the pews, the doctor, the sheriff and his wife, a few of the ranchers who had ridden in the posse. But in that small, humble ceremony, they forged a bond that was stronger than any legal contract, a partnership sanctified not just by God, but by the fire they had walked through together. As Luke slid a simple, thin gold band onto her finger, a ring he had bought by selling his spare saddle, Clara knew she was finally, irrevocably, home. The months that followed were a time of building. With Silas Vaughn sentenced to a long prison term for his crimes, his vast, neglected lands were seized by the county and auctioned off. Luke, using the money he had saved and a loan from the town bank, a loan offered on the strength of his character alone, bought the small, fertile meadow where his cabin stood, along with 100 acres of good grazing land that bordered it. His dream of a horse ranch began to take shape, not as a distant fantasy, but in the sweat of his brow and the calluses on his hands. He built new fences, repaired the old barn, and acquired 2 fine mares to begin his line. Clara, meanwhile, found her own purpose. The primer Luke had taught her from became the cornerstone of a new dream. She remembered the other girls in Dry Hollow, girls with hungry eyes and futures as bleak as her own had been. In the front room of the small house they now rented in town, she started a class. At first, only 3 girls came, shy and wary, their mothers hoping that learning their letters might offer them a life better than their own. Clara taught them with a fierce, gentle patience, using charcoal on shingles, just as Luke had taught her. She was giving them the one thing no one could ever take away, the freedom of their own minds. Their life was not easy. It was filled with the hard work and sacrifice that was the price of building a life from nothing on the frontier. But it was a life of their own making, a life filled with a deep and abiding peace. The ghosts of the past still lingered, their shadows sometimes touching the edges of their quietest moments. But they were no longer menacing specters. They were scars, reminders of a battle fought and won, testaments to the resilience of the human heart. One evening in late spring, as the sun was setting, casting the entire valley in a soft, golden light, Clara and Luke rode out to the meadow where his cabin stood. They were building a proper house there now, a small but sturdy home with real glass windows. The wildflowers were in bloom, a riot of Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and evening primrose, a vibrant carpet of life spread across the once barren land. They stood on the porch of their unfinished house, looking out at the mountains that had once been their prison and their refuge. Luke's arm was wrapped around her shoulders, his presence a warm, solid comfort. Clara leaned into him, a quiet, secret smile on her face. She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach, where the first faint, miraculous flutter of a new life was just beginning to stir. He looked down at her, his eyes asking a question. She nodded, her own eyes shining with tears of a joy so profound it had no words. He gathered her into his arms, his embrace full of a reverent, wondrous tenderness. They stood there for a long time, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. Two souls who had found each other in the deepest of darkness. Theirs was not a love born of perfection or gentle beginnings. It was a wildflower, tough and resilient, that had fought its way through the hardest, stoniest ground to finally, breathtakingly, bloom. Thank you so much for listening to our story today. We'd love to create a community around these tales from the past. So please, take a moment to comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts on Clara and Luke's journey.